Hello, and welcome to the Rockbridge Historical Society program titled Fighting for Freedom, Black Union Soldiers from Rockbridge. There will be a number of related resources archived on our website at rockbridgehistory.org, where you can explore these figures, places, and patterns in more depth. Please contact us at rhs@rockbridgehistory.org if you have questions. I'll introduce our first two presenters, whom I'm glad to count both as friends, collaborators, and mentors in the ways of a number of different kinds of research methods. Special third guest will join us in the middle of the program. Larry Spurgeon and his wife Aileen retired to Rockbridge County from Kansas. He's senior lecturer emeritus at Wichita State University and practiced law for 20 years in Boise and Wichita. A lifelong history and genealogy buff, he is a member of the RHS board and an interpreter at the Jackson House. He has written several papers about Jackson's life, including the enslaved people he owned, his Sabbath school class at Lexington Presbyterian Church, and James Alexander, also known as Jim Lewis. Our second presenter, Lucia Cinder Stanton, retired in 2012 as Shannon Senior Historian at Monticello, where she had worked for more than 30 years. She is the author of Those Who Labor for My Happiness, Slavery at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello in 2012, and co-editor of Thomas Jefferson's memorandum books, published in 1997, and Jefferson Abroad, 1999. From 1993, she directed the Getting Word Project, a research and oral history project on the descendants of Monticello's African American community. My name is Eric Wilson. I'm the executive director of the Rockbridge Historical Society. We look forward to continuing to share our mission in local history in preserving the past for the present. And Larry, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you, Eric. And Cinder and I would like to thank Eric personally for his encouragement and support, enthusiastic support of this whole project. And we'd like to thank him and the Rockbridge Historical Society for hosting this. I can tell you that we are excited and privileged to have this opportunity to share stories of some of these remarkable men. John Logan was a soldier in the 5th U.S. Colored Troops Infantry. The regiment shown in this photograph. He was born in Lexington, Virginia, the son of a free woman of color. A few months ago, while researching free blacks in Rockbridge County, I was looking for some information about John Logan, and I came across a link on Ancestry.com to his military service record. So I downloaded it and became intrigued, and I wanted to know more about him, and so I tracked him to this Soldiers and Sailors Home in 1910, the census. He was one of 27 men of color out of the 1,500 Civil War veterans living there at the time. And so then I started thinking, well, how many other men from Rockbridge may have served in black regiments? Because I had no idea. And so I did a search on Ancestry in a database called U.S. Colored Troops Military Service Records, using Rockbridge as a keyword. And that first search turned up 50 men. And so then I began the process of researching what I could learn about them before, during, and after the war. At some point, I became aware of these two sources that had previously compiled lists of Rockbridge soldiers. And I was gratified to know that their lists were basically the same as mine. There were a couple of new ones. And then Cinder joined me in this project, and she learned of the work of Kelly Mazurek on the 27th Regiment, both a book and a blog. And that's important to us because at least 9 men from Rockbridge served in that regiment, and we learned of several from her work. And also the Now Center at UVA, which has done this amazing work with the Albemarle soldiers and had this digital project that's becoming a real model for this. And they had several resources about how to research, and that enabled us to find several more people. Now, I suppose when many people hear about Black soldiers in the Civil War, the image that comes to mind is the movie Glory from 1989. It's hard to believe it's that long ago. It portrays the famous 54th Massachusetts and the devastating assault at Fort Wagner, South Carolina. The only problem with the movie is its popularity has created a perception ever since that it was the first Black regiment of the Civil War, and indeed that it was the first to really do any recruiting of Black soldiers. But the regiment was formed in early 1863, and it was not the first. So a little background about the evolution of Black service in the war would help. In July 1862, Congress passed the Militia Act, which gave to the president the authority to receive Black soldiers into federal service. Now, Lincoln then, days later, read his Emancipation Proclamation draft to his full cabinet. It would free the slaves in the states in rebellion. Some of his cabinet members urged him to release it immediately, but he was reluctant. The war was not going well for the North militarily, and he was afraid it could hurt morale and Republican chances in the fall elections. He wanted to wait till there was a Union victory. In August of 1862, Senator James Lane of Kansas began organizing the first Black regiment of the Civil War, called the 1st Kansas Volunteer Color. Now, Secretary of War Stanton was not happy about this, told Lane he did not have authority. Lane was a rather irascible character. He was actually a friend of Lincoln, and he simply ignored it and kept on organizing. On September 17th, 1862, Lincoln got the Union victory he had hoped for at a very high price, the bloodiest day in American history to this day, the Battle of Antietam at Sharpsburg, Maryland. Just days later, Lincoln did release or issue the Emancipation Proclamation to take effect January 1st. On October 29th, 1862, the 1st Kansas Colored became the first Black regiment to see action in battle, a small battle known as Island Mound, Missouri. As you can see on the right in a newspaper article, these were the soldiers who were killed and a portion of those wounded. It was portrayed in this drawing on the left by the famous cartoonist Thomas Nast. Over the next month or two, there actually were some other Black regiments formed, one of them by General David Hunter in South Carolina, and he would be paying Lexington a visit a couple of years later. But January 1st did roll around. The Emancipation Proclamation was in effect, and Black recruitment began in earnest, and more regiments were formed. And the 54th Massachusetts was formed, it began in February of 63 when Governor Andrew of Massachusetts called for it. And not too long after that, the 55th Massachusetts was formed. And then in May of 63, this order created the Federal Department of the United States Colored Troops. Some of the state regiments were transferred to federal service. Now we come to Rockbridge. To date, Cinder and I have identified 62 Army soldiers from Rockbridge, and they served in 31 regiments, and there are 2 sailors. We estimate that half or just under half were free before the war. Their ages ranged widely at enlistment, as did their height. The average height of a Civil War soldier was about 5'7". Now, rank is interesting. It was very difficult for men to rank to officer status. These soldiers, we've identified 5 who were promoted all the way to sergeant and 11 corporals. That's 16 or a quarter of them were NCOs, non-commissioned officers. Their occupations varied. While most men were farm laborers or day laborers, there were some skilled craftsmen, certainly blacksmith, shoemaker, carpenter, and there was a medic. We've identified at least 6 from their records who were wounded. It's sometimes difficult to know because the medical information, it doesn't always state why they were hospitalized, but at least 6 were wounded, and 2 of them suffered amputations at some point. One man was killed at the crater, the famous mine explosion in Petersburg. To date, he is the only one we've identified who was killed in action. We'll talk about this man later. and 12 of them died of disease, which even by the Civil War standard of disease is fairly high. They enlisted in 14 states, and for me, this was one of the most surprising things, that these Rockbridge men would enlist from Massachusetts to Louisiana, from Kansas to North Carolina. 15 of them enlisted in Confederate states in the war. And we are going to begin to tell some of their individual stories now, which is the most important part. And we're going to organize those stories around the three sets of circumstances for how they got to these places. The first group are those who were free before the war and living in northern states like Ohio. The second group were escaped in the summer of 1864 when General Hunter's army came through Rockbridge County, and they went west and north to enlist. And the third group are those who were taken to other slave states by their owners, or in some cases sold by their owners to plantation owners in places like Mississippi. And we're going to begin with the men who were free, and that can be broken down in a couple of categories. One are those who were free-born or born free. We need to talk a little bit about what that really means, though. Obviously, being a free Negro, as the Virginia statutes term them, this is the Code of 1849, was hardly the same thing as a white citizen. Yes, they could own property. They could legally marry, unlike enslaved people, but they could not vote. They could not testify against white people in court. And there are restrictions on their movement, severe restrictions on where they can live. This statute sets out a couple of important things. One was the registration process for free Negroes. By statute, a free Negro was required to register with the local county court every 5 years. It was a two-step process. The first step was to go to the court, and the clerk would write down the information in the first red box. Basically physical description. And the reason for that, the rationale behind it, was so that a person would be required to carry their registration papers, and they could be identified to distinguish them from an escaped slave. But it was a demeaning process with identifying these kinds of characteristics. The second step was to then take that application, as it was called, to the judge in court, and the judge would either approve the application for registration or reject it, in which case the person would have to leave. Down below, you can see the penalty. If you were caught without registration papers, the first offense could result in jailing, paying fees, and the second offense could result in punishment with stripes, and that means lashes with a whip. I should point out that in Rockbridge County, and I've done a lot of work in this registration process, it's clear that many free Blacks never registered at all. The statute was not enforced consistently. However, it appears that the registration was much more intense during times of great unrest, like Nat Turner's Rebellion, and closer to the Civil War. So I'm going to talk about a couple of men who were born free. We can document for the records. This is John Logan, the same man I mentioned earlier. In February of 1860, he registered as a free Negro, a free man of color, as it says here. He was the son of Catherine McGinnis, a free woman of color. And the significance of that is a child born to a free woman was free. A child born to an enslaved woman was enslaved, owned by the same owner. And it didn't matter what the father's status was. John Logan's mother being free, his grandmother, Ann McGinnis, was white. So his application was approved. By the summer of 1863, he's in Ohio, and he enlists in Ohio in the 5th Regiment, Company H. He's average height. It says he's 23 years of age, but he is probably somewhat older than that based on other records. On the left are some of the engagements that his regiment took place in: the Crater, I mentioned, New Market Heights near Richmond, and Sherman's campaign through North Carolina. After the war, John Logan married Harriet Andrews, and this is the 1870 census for Parkersburg, West Virginia. It shows them with their daughter Lily. In all, they would have 3 children. Now, after the war, it appears that John and Harriet separated at some point. It's very difficult to track him over the next many years, in fact, until 1910 in the census that I mentioned. This is a military card used for military tombstones, and it has information about his birth in Lexington, his death in 1916, and so forth. And that is his military tombstone. He is buried at the Soldiers and Sailors Home that I mentioned in Sandusky. The other man I wanted to tell you about who was born free was Samuel Mayo. He was born about 1822 in Rockbridge County, and he was the son of Polly Mayo, who was free. His father, Charles Mayo, was enslaved. And it says in this obituary, actually, that he worked to purchase his father's freedom, and that was fairly common, actually. And then the family moved from Virginia to Ohio sometime in the 1840s. He was a member of the 27th Regiment, Company K. After the war, he lived a long time, till 1912. He was just a few months short of his 90th birthday. And so far, he seems to be the longest lived of all the soldiers that we know about. He was well known in his community and was respected. In 1902, his house burned, and his local GAR chapter, that's Grand Army of the Republic, a veterans group, built him a new house. This is more of the obituary, and as you can see at the bottom, he requested to be buried in the Soldiers' Circle at the Oakdale Cemetery, where he himself had been a caretaker. So now I'd like to turn it over to Cinder to talk to you about some of the men from Rockbridge County who were emancipated.
Thank you, Larry, and hello to everyone out there. We're very excited by this project, and it's one I came to late. Larry had already found the names that he talked about, and he had done really phenomenal work compiling biographical information on the men. So that meant that I had a chance to think in a different way. I wanted to think about the shared experience of the soldiers all from the same place and seek out some backstories. I wondered about the 20 men who enlisted in Ohio. Why were so many of them there, and how did they get there? Larry talked about the two men who were born free. There were others that he talked about too. And a number of other Rockbridge soldiers began their lives in slavery and then became free through emancipation. And this path to freedom was not an easy one. It could be very tricky to navigate. The emancipators and the emancipated had to deal with repressive Virginia laws, as well as to consider the views of their neighbors, who were by and large hostile to the free Black population. I'll mention a couple of examples. Robert Allen grew up on an Ohio farm and was born in slavery in eastern Rockbridge County. His mother, Hannah Allen, was freed in 1824 by the will of David Templeton, who wrote that all my slaves shall have their freedom. Temple didn't free her husband, who belonged to another person, and his will stipulated that Hannah's 3 very young children would not become free until 21 in the case of James and Robert, and age 18 for the 2-year-old Elizabeth. Hannah Allen was now free, but her husband and children were still locked in slavery. And she was subject to a Virginia law of 1806 that compelled freed slaves to leave the state within a year of their emancipation. The penalty for failing to comply was sale back into slavery. For Hannah Allen and the many others in her situation, choosing freedom could mean separation from family. This 1806 removal law, as it's been called, really discouraged manumissions in Virginia. They slowed way down, but slaveholders who were determined to be emancipators developed strategies to free their slaves without shattering family bonds. At first glance, David Templeton's decision to keep Hannah's children in slavery until adulthood looks cruel. But the documents suggest that he and Hannah and some of his friends together worked out a way to avoid upsetting the local community and to allow the Allens to remain together. So after Templeton's death, Hannah Allen petitioned the Virginia legislature for permission to remain in the state, and her petition was supported by 26 white citizens, and apparently Templeton arranged this before his death, and she was granted permission to remain. The men and women who signed their names here certified that Hannah had been a faithful, honest, industrious, and obedient slave, adding, "We believe she cannot leave this county without great injury to her children." Many other newly freed slaves without this kind of backing from the white community had their petitions rejected. In the same period, another soldier, Isaac Paul, had been freed by Esther Paul, whose will freed his grandmother Sarah, her 7 children, and her 4 grandchildren. And Esther Paul knew that freeing 11 people all at once would not be popular in the county, which at that time was actively establishing its own chapter of the American Colonization Society, which promoted the removal of free blacks to Liberia with their permission. So Esther Paul prepared for the effects of the 1806 law by bequeathing her entire estate to Sarah so that she would be able to purchase a settlement in some one of the free states and pay for relocating there. After Esther Paul's death, Sarah Paul and her large family registered as free people of color. And on the bottom right, you can see the register of Isaac Paul that I mentioned at the age of 4 months and 22 days. And he's described as a bright mulatto with no visible scars. After registering, the family very quickly left for Southern Ohio. They were in Pike County by 1830. But Hannah Allen had to wait until her children were adults. So they couldn't leave until the 1840s. The Allens settled in a freeback farming community on the border of Ross and Pike counties, not far from the Pauls. And their close neighbor was the son of Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson, Madison Hemings, who had come there with his family a few years earlier. And this is his farm on the left. The Baptist church there, now known as Eden Baptist Church, was the heart of this community and a center of Underground Railroad activity. This map shows this area on the borders of Ross and Pike County. And this area was a magnet for free people of color migrating north from both Virginia and North Carolina and other places probably too. In 1864, Robert Allen and Isaac Paul and 7 other Rockbridge men joined the 27th U.S. Colored Infantry, the 2nd Black Regiment organized in Ohio. And they soon found themselves back in Virginia, which some had left decades earlier, and in the dreadful conditions of the Petersburg front, mostly doing heavy labor, chopping down trees, digging rifle pits, building entrenchments and bomb proofs, if you want to see what a bomb proof was. 38 USCT regiments took part in the long Petersburg-Richmond campaign, the largest concentration of Black troops in the war. And this is the camp of the 27th Regiment. Almost 30 of the men from Rockbridge were somewhere on the Petersburg front, including the one battle fatality that Larry mentioned, Thomas Clark, who also lived in the same area of Pike County, Ohio, was killed in the tragic events of July 30th, 1864, after the Union attempt to breach the Confederate fortifications with a massive explosion at the end of a 500-foot tunnel. Afterwards, many blamed the inexperienced Black troops for the fiasco that was the Battle of the Crater, but most agree that the Union leadership was responsible for its failure. A lieutenant in the 27th wrote afterward, "No heroes ever fought more valiantly than many colored men did that day. This is acknowledged by all." This was the first combat experience for some, and they went into battle knowing what might happen if they were captured. The report of the massacre of Black soldiers by Confederate troops at Fort Pillow in Tennessee 3 months earlier was still fresh in everyone's minds. The 27th carried a banner which said Fort Pillow, and "Remember Fort Pillow" was the battle cry shouted by the Black troops as they charged into the carnage of the crater. The Confederacy had been refusing to recognize the military status of captured Black men in uniform. As one Southern journalist put it, "We cannot treat Negroes taken in arms as prisoners of war without a destruction of the social system for which we contend." And there are horrific accounts of how captured Black soldiers were treated after the Battle of the Crater. Isaac Paul had been promoted to corporal in May, but soon after the crater, he succumbed to the grueling physical conditions of the Petersburg front. He was transferred from one hospital to another and finally died in November of chronic diarrhea at Louverture, the hospital for Black soldiers in Alexandria. Paul was buried in the Alexandria Freedmen's Cemetery, but a month later was disinterred and reburied in the Soldiers Cemetery, now the Alexandria National Cemetery. And this was thanks to his fellow patients at Louverture, many of them who had been wounded at the crater. And they included another Rockbridge man, Humphrey McDowell. In a successful campaign for equal rights, McDowell and other sick and wounded men at the hospital protested the practice of burying Black soldiers in a civilian cemetery rather than the military burial ground. Their petition, signed by McDowell and over 400 other patients, and these are some of the men who signed this petition and were there. The petition said, "We should share the same privileges and rights of burial in every way with our fellow soldiers who only differ from us in color." This is the commander of the 27th USCI, Albert Blackman, and he missed the Battle of the Crater, but he was present with the regiment for one of its finest hours. In January 1865, after an unpleasant sea voyage, Union forces took Fort Fisher below Wilmington in North Carolina. Many accounts gave short shrift to the role of the Black troops here, and you can see that Currier and Ives left them out entirely. But the white quartermaster of the 27th sent an excited report to an Ohio newspaper about the notable part played by what he called the Buckeye Black Boys, and it was a significant victory. As he said, when the fort's general asked, "To whom do I have the honor of surrendering with my forces?" the regiment's adjutant answered, "To General Blackman of the 27th United States Colored Troops." And the 27th was commended for its pursuit and capture of Confederate prisoners, and they were placed as guards over 500 Southerners. As the adjutant said, "Master was compelled to march behind the bayonet held in the hands of a former slave." I'm going to talk pretty briefly about the two Massachusetts regiments, for one reason, because their story is so well known, and for another, because we know so little about the four Rockbridge men who served in them. They were living in Ohio and eastern Indiana in the spring of 1863, when they signed up and made the 800-mile journey to Boston to join a Massachusetts regiment. And that's because the 1st Ohio Regiment, the 5th, that Larry mentioned, was not organized until August. And one of them is one of our biggest mysteries. Samuel Kenny was the only blacksmith in the Rockbridge cohort. He was almost the earliest Rockbridge man to enlist, April 8th, 1863. He served in the most renowned Black regiment and was wounded in the famous assault on Fort Wagner, a severe knee injury. But we haven't found a scrap of information about him before or after the war. Our only guess so far is that he, like many Black Union soldiers, enlisted under an assumed name because he was an escaped slave. Both Massachusetts regiments illustrate how, for African Americans, serving in the US Army was about more than preserving the Union, about more than ending slavery. It was also about the pursuit of equality and full citizenship rights. Because of the film Glory, the struggle of Black soldiers in the 54th for equal pay is well known. The 55th Massachusetts was just as active and eloquent on this issue. The four Rockbridge men, that's Kenny and William and David Moore in the 54th and Henry Ritchie in the 55th, would all have gone for 18 months without pay until their protests bore fruit with the arrival of the first pay packets in October 1864. One company in the 55th actually wrote to President Lincoln, "To us, money is no object. We came to fight for liberty, justice, and equality." The 54th and 55th are particularly notable for having the first Black commissioned officers. The very first was Stephen Swales of the 54th, commissioned a second lieutenant in March 1864. And 2 weeks later, it was the turn of John Freeman Shorter of the 55th, a descendant of the Hemmingses of Monticello. And each regiment got 2 more lieutenants by war's end, including 2 other men connected to the Hemmingses by marriage. One was James Monroe Trotter, father of the famous militant champion of equal rights, William Monroe Trotter. In July 1864, Henry Ritchie, whose family had settled in the same area of Southern Ohio as Allen, Paul, and Clark, was probably itching to get his first taste of battle. For him and the other men of the 55th, the battle at Rivers Causeway near Charleston was a profoundly important moment for them. James Trotter reported that after 2 other regiments began retreating in panic, the 55th's commander, Colonel Alfred S. Hartwell, cried, "Bring forward the 55th!" exclamation point. Letters from soldiers, even those written 40 years later, emphasized the thrill of reaching the parapet of the Confederate battery and capturing 2 12-pound Napoleon guns, which they placed as trophies outside their Folly Island headquarters. The Battle of Honey Hill in November was the regiment's equivalent of the 54th's courageous but doomed charge on Fort Wagner. It too was doomed from the start, but it proved, as one of their white officers later said, that Black soldiers could behave as gallantly under fire as the best troops in the service. John Shorter was badly wounded, so he missed the moment that Henry Ritchie and the whole of the 55th had been waiting for. This was the fall of Charleston in mid-February 1865, when the 55th led their brigade into the city, singing the battle cry of freedom and national airs long unheard there. Now for the second path to freedom, escaping with the Union Army. And this story begins in mid-June 1864 in Lexington, when it was occupied by federal troops under General David Hunter. It's about the men who took advantage of the Army's presence to throw off the bonds of slavery without asking permission. And by all accounts, many slaves of both the town and county escaped during these turbulent days, which included the burning of VMI and the mills and factories at Jordan's Point. A VMI professor's wife wrote that the servants are flocking away. After defeat at Lynchburg a few days later, Hunter's troops were soon straggling north through the mountains to Union-occupied towns in West Virginia. And we know of at least 10 Rockbridge men who not only joined the Union wagon train, but who joined the Union Army as soldiers within days of reaching West Virginia. One was Jackson Baldock, who more than 20 years later spoke about his own journey to freedom. He left from southern Rockbridge County, as he said, "I was owned by William Paxton. I ran away during the war and enlisted at Cleveland, Ohio, about a month after." It was really fantastic to have Baldock's own words about this critical point in his life. And it's thanks to Kelly Meserek, who shared a pension record for which he was a witness. And pension records are often the most informative sources for Civil War soldiers. They've been out of our reach, however, for the whole COVID year because the National Archives have been closed. So there is lots more to be learned. Baldock and the 9 other refugees, as Hunter called them, traveled with the Union supply train. Soldiers from 2 Ohio regiments escorted 120 or more wagons over the Allegheny Ridges, carrying sick and wounded soldiers, Confederate prisons, and a great many slaves, men, women, and children. Along the way, they burned bridges and destroyed the Grace Iron Works in Botetourt County, and they were ambushed by partisan rangers. They often changed their route to avoid bushwhackers or impossible gorges. And I had an ambitious goal of tracing the route on a map of Virginia and West Virginia, but my skill level was inadequate. So I've just given you the starting point, Fincastle, and the finishing point, Grafton, Virginia. At one point, they had to destroy 50 wagons, which meant that many of the escaped slaves had to continue on foot. But the wagon train arrived safely behind Union lines in West Virginia. One wagon actually carried the statue of George Washington, which was taken from the VMI campus as a trophy of war and exhibited in Wheeling. This photo is from 1866, after the statue's return and rededication. So far, we have only one, there may be 2, Larry will comment on that, but one photograph of the 62 Rockbridge soldiers, and that is George Edmondson, who was one of the men who made this 200-mile journey through the mountains and enlisted in the 45th USCT Regiment, the only one accredited to West Virginia. Before I introduce George Edmondson's great-grandson, I'll introduce his grandfather. In 1805, Brown Colbert, then a 20-year-old nail maker at Monticello, persuaded a well-known Lexington resident to buy him from President Thomas Jefferson. John Jordan had been working as a brick mason on the Monticello house and was about to return to Lexington with his slaves. As Jordan wrote Jefferson, "Your man Brown has one of my girls for a wife, and they appear unwilling to part." For Brown Colbert, who was a nephew of Sally Hemings, being sold away from all his extended family at Monticello was the only way he could prevent separation from his wife. Brown and Mary Colbert had a daughter, Melinda, who at some point became the property of Governor James McDowell of Call Alto, and she and her 8 children were the most important enslaved domestic servants at Call Alto. After McDowell's death in 1851, Melinda's son George became the property of Lexington merchant and hatter Jacob M. Ruff, and it was from Ruff's household that George Edmondson left Lexington with Hunter's troops. He left behind, enslaved in Brownsburg, a pregnant wife, Mariah, and a 4-year-old daughter. And we at Monticello would never have known anything about George Edmondson if it hadn't been for the research of his descendant, Bill Webb, and his wife, Eva, whom we first met in 2007. So I'm excited to say that Bill Webb and Eva are joining us tonight. Eva's at the controls, I believe. And we're so glad and grateful that you're here to tell the story of your quest for your great-grandfather. Bill?
Good evening. I am Bill Webb, the great-grandson of George Edmondson, I want to thank Eric, Larry, and the Rockbridge Historical Society for the invitation, and certainly Cinder. And I always acknowledge my wife, Eva Webb, for the many years of research on my family. The research did bring us to Lexington, Virginia in 2012. My introduction to George Edmondson when I was 10 or 12 years old, 1952, 54. In my parents' attic was a wind-up Victrola with a large family Bible on top. For me to enjoy the music of the one-sided records, I would have to move this heavy Bible. First, let me describe the family Bible. It's approximately 10 inches, 12 by 12 inches, and at least 4 3/4 thick. Beautifully illustrated, a pictorial family Bible. The copyright date is 1881. Also, it included a history of other religions and denominations, a map of the Holy Land, and even pictures of the wild animals of the scriptures, a dictionary of the Bible, and then a family section, only 2 pages. And on these 2 pages were listed births, deaths, and marriages. An envelope stuck between the pages of the family Bible contained promotion papers of a George Edmondson. His promotion to corporal, the 127th Regiment, Company G, USCT, dated July 4th, 1865, in Brazos, Santiago, Texas, and George Edmondson's discharge paper from the same regiment, dated September the 8th, 1865, also in Texas. I asked my mother and her sister if they had any information and who was George Edmondson. Of course, they knew it was their grandfather, and they had lived for many years next door to their grandparents. But other than that, no real information could be given. So I placed the envelope back in the Bible. Jumpstart to May 1974. I took Eva to Parkersburg, West Virginia, only several weeks after our marriage here in New York. And I showed her the Bible, it's still in the attic, same place, and we made notations. And several years later, we went to the National Archives and called up his military and pension records. Of course, this provided a wealth of information, not only of his life, but of the extended family. Examples of part of his folder. This is from 1898. And some of the questions that are answered on this form. The first, are you married? If so, state your wife's full name and maiden name. He says, yes, I'm married. And he gives his wife's name, maiden name, I should say, as Mariah McDowell. The second question, where, when, and by whom were you married? He states, December 25th, 1860, Brownsburg, Virginia. They're asking if he has any record of this. And he says, I have no record. They also ask for a listing of his children. And he would list them, including my grandmother, who was his eldest child, Melinda, born 1859. Another piece of important information, this is from 1907. It says George was born on the 25th day of March, 1836 in Lexington, Virginia. And this record is taken from a family Bible of Samuel Edmondson. And then it says the Bible is now in the care of a Mrs. George W. Cook, Howard University, Washington, D.C. And this is when I'm saying, then I have to figure out, and we research, why would someone have the family Bible unless they were connected by blood to the family? And of course they were. And the last one that I'll mention is that, again, they're asking, this time, children both alive and deceased. He lists 2 of his children as deceased, and one is a Brown Edmondson. This gives theory and credence to the naming pattern, but also that the story of Brown Covert, his grandfather, was still alive at that time. And obviously that's why this child was named Brown. Unfortunately, he died at 3 or 4 years old. Jumpstart to 1998. A monument was dedicated at the African American Civil War Memorial in Washington, D.C. George's name appears on the Wall of Honor, both for his service in the 127th Regiment, USCT, and the 45th Regiment. We weren't aware of any information or connection to a 45th Regiment. But in May 2010, we learned that George's enlistment, August the 22nd, 1864, in Wheeling, West Virginia, was originally in the West Virginia Regiment of the 45th. And so we found out that he was eligible for a medal that the state of West Virginia had issued all of their soldiers. Here is a little background on the Civil War soldier medals. The medals were authorized by the West Virginia legislature in 1866. The medals included not only a ribbon, but in sunken letters on the milling edge of each medal is the soldier's name, rank, company, and regiment. On December 4th, 2010, we received a medal, a genuine piece of Civil War history, and doubly rare for those medals to go to soldiers who were part of the USCT. On January 2012, an exhibit, Slavery at Jefferson's Monticello, Paradox of Liberty, opened at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. George's picture appeared with the Hemings family Civil War Union soldiers. This exhibit has traveled to several cities within the United States. Additionally, George is a subject in an essay in the book, Those Who Labor for My Happiness by Cinder, Stanton, published 2012. And George is also profiled in the Getting Word project. This records the oral history of the descendants of Monticello's enslaved families. On October 14th, 2012, a marker was placed on his grave in the Spring Grove Cemetery, Parkersburg, West Virginia. On January 4th, 2013, a presidential memorial certificate was received from the President of the United States, Barack Obama. One of the highlights of all of this research that I've mentioned happened, I should say, on May the 25th, 2013. A commemoration ceremony was held at the Spring Grove Cemetery in Parkersburg. Members of the General Benjamin D. Fearing Camp Number 2 of the Sons of the Union Veterans of the Civil War participated. A musket gun salute was fired and taps was played at the end of the ceremony. This was made possible by the efforts of a local historian in Parkersburg, the Spring Grove Cemetery Association, and George's descendants, the Washington/Webb family. This was followed by a program in the local Baptist church where I was the keynote speaker. I might add that today is Flag Day, and if it were not for the COVID restrictions, I would have marched today in a parade in Lower Manhattan, ending up at Francis Tavern. I am now a member of the local camp of the Sons of the Union Veterans of the Civil War. In conclusion, I would like to read excerpts from a poem named, or called, I should say, The Storyteller. We are chosen. My feelings are in each family. There is one who seems called to find the answers, to put flesh on the bones and make them alive again, to tell the family story and to feel that somehow they know and approve. It is up to one called in the next generation to answer the call and to take their place in the long line of family storytellers. That is why I do my family stories. And that is what calls those young and old to stand up and put flesh on the bones. Thank you.
And thank you, Bill and Eva, so much for participating with us in this program. I'm assuming that I'm unmuted, but my machine is behaving very strangely, so I hope you can hear me. And I wanted to say a bit more about these Rockbridge men who ran to get into the fight for freedom. I can't help thinking about the men of the 45th so soon finding themselves right back in Virginia in the thick of the Petersburg and Richmond campaigns. George Edmondson, who had been transferred to the 127th Regiment, was wounded at one of the engagements there at Deep Bottom. Finally, the 10-month siege of Petersburg came to an end on April 3rd, 1865, and Corporal George Edmondson and the rest of his brigade were the first Union troops to enter the city. And they went right out the other side in pursuit of Robert E. Lee's army, so that on April 9th, Edmondson and 7 other Rockbridge soldiers were at Appomattox Courthouse when the surrender was announced to both armies. But war service wasn't over for many. At least 11 of the Rockbridge men spent miserable months at the very southern tip of Texas at Brownsville and Brazos, Santiago. While the white regiments of the US Army had mustered out and gone home, 18 black regiments still had time to serve. So they were sent to guard the border with Mexico because of French intervention there. And one of the soldiers described the barren barrier island of Brazos, Santiago as the most godforsaken spot in the wide world. Water and fresh vegetables were scarce, scurvy was rampant, and many ended up in the hospital. Among them, Robert Allen and George Edmondson. And Charles William of the 45th died there. Meanwhile, several hundred miles up the coast at Galveston on June 19th, 1865, Union General Gordon Granger announced that all the slaves in Texas were free. General Order Number 3, the moment commemorated as Juneteenth. George Edmondson survived to return to Lexington after the war to collect his family and take them to Parkersburg, West Virginia, where he worked to buy a home and to provide his children with the education he was denied. He was the pillar of his church, and in 1922, the newspaper noted the passing of one of Parkersburg's leading citizens after a long and useful life. The 11 men at Brazos went farther west than just about all the others from Rockbridge, but we'll go back to Larry now to learn about some men who did go west, but not by choice.
Thank you, Cinder. Just take a second here to get it going. As Cinder said, some of the men were taken, and this is a drawing by a well-known folk artist who drew what he observed, and this is from the 1850s. His name was Lewis Miller, and this is a drawing of a coffle of slaves, which means a group of slaves being chained together, bound together, being marched from Stanton, Virginia to Tennessee. Mississippi was by far the most prominent state as far as destinations of enslaved people from Virginia, many, many thousands, in fact. And we know, for example, that a number of enslaved people were taken from Rockbridge County to Mississippi. The Washington College, now Washington and Lee enslaved people, were sold, several dozen, to a man named Samuel Garland, who took them to Hinds County, Mississippi, which is where Jackson is. That was in 1836. When Governor McDowell died in 1851, he owned 15 enslaved people in Mississippi, and that's just a couple of instances. The reason Mississippi was so prominent in that capacity was this: cotton. Of course, excruciating, backbreaking work, compounded by the heat and humidity of Mississippi. It became common in more northern areas for slave owners to threaten their slaves with being sold downriver. It's something that Virginia slaves would have been very mindful of. The Rockbridge soldiers who enlisted in Mississippi and some of their surrounding states, the reason they were able to enlist in Confederate states in the middle of the war is because the Union Army was liberating various areas of these Louisiana and Mississippi. Now, this map's kind of complicated with all the lines, but basically General Grant's army moved up from Port Gibson to Jackson, the Battle of Jackson in May of '63, and then over west to Vicksburg on the Mississippi River, and the siege of Vicksburg, which took weeks. That siege ended with the Union victory at Vicksburg on July 4th, 1863. A man from Rockbridge, Alfred Holmes, enlisted the very next day at Vicksburg. He was 28 years of age and he was in the 50th USCT Infantry. He died just 2 months later at Vicksburg of disease, probably the first of the Rockbridge soldiers to die during the war. Andrew Logan was the medic that I referred to earlier. That's my term for it. He's called Dr. Logan in his enlistment form, and a nurse on this form and some other things. He was in his mid-40s when he enlisted in initially the 1st Mississippi Cavalry African Descent State Regiment, and that later became the 3rd Cavalry USCT. Apparently the only cavalry soldier on our list. He too enlisted at Vicksburg in October of '63, and he too died of disease just a few months later. His widow, Eliza Logan, applied for a widow's pension in 1868. Watson Randolph enlisted in the 5th Artillery, what was called Heavy Artillery Regiment, and he also enlisted in Vicksburg, although later, in January of '65. He's the man I referred to earlier as supposedly being killed by citizens of DeSoto County, Mississippi. He deserted somewhere around December 1st, 1865, as you can see in the card on the right, and we know nothing more about the circumstances. Emmanuel Washington deserted twice. The first time in 1863, he was apprehended and then returned to duty, and then deserted again in 1865, and apparently survived the war. Desertion, of course, could result in very severe penalties on both armies, including, in some cases, execution. Cinder mentioned the Battle of Fort Pillow and the battle cry that was heard at Petersburg and other places. This occurred in April of 1864, and it was a battle in which the army of General Nathan Bedford Forrest, Confederate general, won a victory in Western Tennessee. And the reason it's infamous was because many dozen Black soldiers were executed rather than being captured. Some, it is believed, were taken south and enslaved. This battle is, there's a lot of dispute about the actual numbers of soldiers killed and the circumstances, but what seems to be very clear is that many soldiers were executed. Samuel Carruthers of the 11th Regiment was there. His regiment was at Fort Pillow. You can see this is another case of a man, by the way, who may have gone under an assumed name because of the number of people in his regiment with the same name. He died in 1891, so he clearly survived this. And you can see that his widow filed for a widow's pension in 1894. I want to mention the two sailors. We didn't really know where to stick them because it didn't fit into the other categories, except they were near and on the Mississippi River. We know nothing about them beyond the bare information from their enlistment papers. Joseph Wilson enlisted in New Orleans in 1863. He served on 2 ships. The second ship was the USS Rodolph, which was destroyed by a mine explosion in Mobile Bay, Alabama in April 65. Several sailors were killed. The second sailor was Alexander Jackson. He enlisted late in the war in Cincinnati, which is on the Ohio River, of course, and he served on the Grosbeak. And the main claim to fame for this ship was that it pulled dozens of survivors from the water after the explosion of the Sultana near Memphis in April 65. It remains the greatest maritime disaster in American history. More than 1,500, perhaps 1,700 or more men were killed. Many of them had just been released from Confederate prisons. These were Union soldiers who had been prisoners of war. Some of the Rockbridge men were taken to slave states in the North, these so-called border states that remained loyal to the Union, at least technically. And this General Order number 329 promised a $300 bounty to loyal slave owners for each enslaved person who enlisted in the Union Army. One example is Patrick Rutherford. His owner, John Thompson from Virginia, took Patrick to Missouri, and Thompson died in the late 1850s, and his estate sold Patrick to William T. Rutherford of Randolph County, Missouri. This is the actual bill of sale, and the sales price was $905, which is roughly equivalent to $32,000 today. Patrick Rutherford enlisted in the 60th USCT. He was 29 and a farm laborer. You see on the left, and he enlisted in Macon, Missouri. Initially, he actually enlisted in a state regiment, the 1st Iowa. The AD stands for African Descent. And this is the oath of allegiance signed by his owner, William T. Rutherford, to qualify for the $300. This happened in 1864. After the war, Patrick Rutherford returned to Macon, Missouri, and lived there the rest of his life. This is his obituary in 1907. He was a well-respected member of his community as well. There are actually several articles about him. But this is Missouri, 1907. And as you can see in this obituary, there is derogatory, caricaturist terminology about a Black person. The last lines are poignant, peace to his honest old soul. This is William McCorkle, who was from Lexington, Virginia. In the late 1850s, he moved his family, wife and children, as well as his enslaved people, probably 10 to 12, to Carroll County, Missouri. On the right is an excerpt from the 1860 census, which had a slave schedule. The slaves were not mentioned by name, but by gender and age. The red box is probably for the 2 men he owned who enlisted in the Union Army. The first is Samuel McCorkle, who was in the 62nd Infantry, also a farm laborer. You can see on the box on the lower left, he claimed to have been a slave for William McCorkle. Now, why would he claim to be that if it's a voluntary enlistment? It wasn't a voluntary enlistment, as I'll explain. He was promoted to corporal, and that rank was reduced for unknown reasons. After the war, he died long after the war, in 1915, in Livingston, Missouri. And I thought this cause of death is very poignant. You can see that after the death of his wife, the previous month, he refused to eat. The other man who was owned by William McCorkle was John Beale, and we know very little about him. He enlisted at 30, he was 6'1". And this form on the right is a claim for the $300 by the estate of William McCorkle. This is signed in 1867. William McCorkle, had died in 1864 of disease. What's interesting about this is the administrator of the estate is signing a loyalty oath to get the money, which is pretty easy to do since the war is over, but William McCorkle was a Confederate officer, a major in the Confederate Army. This is the battle flag for the 1st Kansas Colored, which I mentioned earlier. And we have a soldier who was in that regiment, Scott Cornell. I believe it is pronounced Cornell. It's spelled that way sometimes. Enlisted in March of '63, the first Rockbridge soldier to enlist. And his regiment, the 1st Kansas Colored, became the 79th USCT later. He only served 9 months because in July of '63, he was severely wounded in the hip at the Battle of Honey Springs, Indian Territory. And I've seen that battle reenacted in Oklahoma. He was from Rockbridge County, born about 1844, and was a slave before the war, it says here. He was almost certainly an escaped slave from Missouri, as were many of the men in that regiment. This photo has been posted on Ancestry.com, but the people who posted it said it may be him. In other words, it's not clear. The inscription on the left was on the back of this photograph, and it's in California. As Cinder referred to this earlier, we're not sure about this. For one thing, he spent much of the 1880s at a disabled veterans home in Hampton, Virginia. He had had a lot of trouble. His leg had been amputated at the hip, and he'd had a lot of trouble with the prosthesis. The other thing is he was described as white on some of the censuses late in life, and apparently was passing for perhaps Hispanic, because he actually said his father was born in Cuba on one of the censuses. At any rate, it may or may not be him. Incredibly, later in life, he ended up out west, first in Colorado as a miner, and then in Nevada. This newspaper article on the left from 1910 in Nevada describes some success he'd had mining. He was in his mid-60s at this point. And you can see at the bottom left, he had lost his leg, so it is him. And he died in 1917 in Dayton, Nevada. A few years ago, some local researchers in Dayton came across his battered old tombstone, and they saw the initials USCI and did some research and discovered it was Scott Cornell. So they arranged to have a new tombstone put up, and they had a ceremony seen on the left, which was picked up in a number of newspapers. The last soldier we're going to talk about is Peter Fleming of the 55th Massachusetts. And the question is whether he's the same man as Peter Fleming of Lexington. This is a map of Lexington in the 1850s, hand-drawn, obviously. The colleges are on the left. Lexington Presbyterian Church is at the top center, called New Presbyterian Church here. That's at Nelson and Main Streets. And on the right is the home of David McKinley, just south of the cemetery on Main Street. He was an Irish immigrant who came to Lexington in the 1830s. Excuse me. He died in 1854 a single man, and he left a will in which he emancipated the two enslaved people he owned, Peter Fleming, who was in his early 20s, and Mary Ann Burr, who was older. He gave each of them a house, and Peter Fleming received the main dwelling house on Main Street. Appraisers of estates were required by law to assess all the property of the deceased. Slaves were property. So Peter Fleming was assessed a value of $1,000. You can see Mary Ann Burr was assessed a value of $300. And again, that $1,000 would have been equivalent to roughly $35,000 today. Peter Fleming registered as a free Negro in July 54. This is very hard to read, but it says he was 22, 5 feet 10 3/4 inches, and his color was dark, almost quite black. Mary Ann Burr and Peter Fleming petitioned the court for permission to remain in Virginia. This is something that Cinder talked about earlier, but unlike Hannah Allen, who had the support of white citizens, they did not. Their petition was met with this letter signed by citizens. The last sentence reads, "We think that such a population mixing with our slaves is injurious, and that nothing but evil can come of increasing the number." It was signed by 67 white men. I jokingly say I live in Lexington in the 1850s. Many of these names are familiar to me: prominent citizens, lawyers, doctors, business people. The name with the blue star is John Letcher, lawyer, newspaperman, and just a few years later, governor of Virginia, Virginia's wartime governor. The judge rejected the petition. I think the signatures had a lot to do with that. I suppose the citizens didn't like the idea of an emancipated young slave having prime real estate on Main Street. Peter Fleming and Mary Ann Burr sold the real estate. This is Peter's deed to William Rhodes, signed by his mark. And he went to Ohio, and we don't hear about him again in Lexington for 13 years. Pan ahead, 8 years, 1863. Peter Fleming of Albany, Ohio, enlists in the 55th Massachusetts, that Cinder talked about. He was 29, he was 5'10" and dark. He was born in Goochland County, Virginia, and I've done some research on this, and there were many Flemings in that county, both free and enslaved, and several men named Peter Fleming. He enlisted in Massachusetts. The school he taught at was probably the Albany Manual Labor Academy, which had been founded by abolitionists and which had been attended by a number of prominent people, including James Monroe Trotter, who Cinder talked about. And one of the board members was Salmon Chase, Lincoln's Secretary of Treasury, later Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Peter Fleming was promoted all the way to Sergeant Major. He took Trotter's place when Trotter was promoted to lieutenant, the highest ranking NCO in the regiment. On the right is his medical history. He had typhoid at one point, and he was wounded near Honey Hill in the ankle. He did recover, and after the war moved to Cincinnati. Back to Lexington. Peter Fleming of Lexington returned for a visit. He still had some money due him under McKinley's will. He had done well in Ohio, it says. And when he got to Lexington, he learned that McKinley had no tombstone. So he hired a stonemason to make one, actually two, a headstone and a footstone. This newspaper article was picked up in Richmond and many other places. The narrative being, isn't it great that the loyal slave do this? Well, I think it might have been genuine. David McKinley was an Irish immigrant and they were on the bottom of white society. At any rate, this is the tombstone. You can see erected by Peter Fleming, his former slave. This is in Oak Grove Cemetery on Main Street in Lexington. You go in the main gate from Main Street side, turn left. It's the first tombstone. After the war, as I said, Peter Fleming of the 55th Massachusetts moved to Cincinnati. He married Mariah Jackson in '69, a woman with 3 children, and this is the family in 1870. This is the only census reference to either Peter Fleming I've ever found. 6 years later, very tragic, Peter Fleming of Cincinnati was arrested during that year, threatened his wife. The article made clear alcohol was involved. And then just a few months later, while walking along a railroad track at 4:30 in the morning, intoxicated, he either stumbled into or jumped in front of a moving locomotive. It wasn't clear, and was killed. A tragic and to a man who was sergeant major in the 55th Massachusetts. Were they the same man? The circumstantial evidence is very strong that they were. Mentioned that I was a lawyer. I had trials in court and civil cases. This would easily meet the standard for burden of proof in a civil case, but this is history and we're not sure. They were the same height, age, and color. They were both from Virginia. They both were free before the war and living in Ohio and lived in Ohio afterwards. But we'll have to leave it there for now. After the war, the Black soldiers were proud of their service, just like their white counterparts. The GAR was integrated, although some local chapters were not. This is a chapter in Norfolk, Virginia in 1910. And kind of a fun fact, this is a Civil War, an article about the last survivors of the Civil War in 1951. There's one Black man on that page. And Joseph Cleese was believed to be the last veteran of the USCT. I want to mention that earlier it was referred to that we're going to have information posted on the Rockbridge Historical website. Cinder and I have prepared a spreadsheet with the soldiers and the essential information, very helpful for a quick read. And for a longer read, there is a summary that we have worked on of the biographical information of these men before and after the war, as well as some information about the regiments. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Cinder to talk a little bit about some of these important sources.
Yes, thank you, Larry. And I want to give thanks to 4 people who were very important to this project. Ellen Esslinger, whose work has been critical to our projects. Everywhere I would look for information, there was Ellen, who had been there before us. And many thanks also to Will Kurtz in Charlottesville and Kelly Mazurek up in Ohio for their inspiration and also for so generously sharing material that they had collected. And also Bob Vernon, who created a monumental collection of public records that are very hard to find. And he was helpful to us in getting us up and running with access to elusive public records. Thank you all. And there are lots of beautifully framed daguerreotypes of Black Union soldiers like these, once obviously treasured, but now many of them, like countless old photographs, are unidentified. Might some be the Rockbridge men of the 27th, 45th, and other regiments we've talked about? What can be done to bring into the light the men who fought for freedom, justice, and equality, as the men of the 55th said, including those from beyond Rockbridge. None of the men we talked about returned to live in this county, but they definitely left relatives behind here. So where are their descendants? Do they have photographs or memories to add to this still unfolding story? If you have thoughts about how we can best remember and honor these men, not forgetting their wives and dependents who also made sacrifices, do contact the Rockbridge Historical Society, and you'll learn more about that now.
Cinder speaks rightly and well about the importance of extending these narratives through family lines, as you've heard so powerfully and authentically through Bill Webb. Larry notes how this work will continue at a research level and continue to spool out through our lifelong education programs, in programs like these and other opportunities to volunteer. But one thing with the Rockbridge Historical Society that we're poised and experienced to do is to find footholds in schools to help bring these kinds of ideas, experiences, and exposure to life with students. On the left, you'll see here our website. This is our local Black Histories portal where a number of related materials have lived. We'll be developing another one for these specific materials, again, where you can see the slides, you can find the spreadsheet and summaries and different kinds of recordings and access points to revisit and to rethink things. But particularly as the curricula of Virginia schools and United States schools continue to grow and to enrich, the standards for the state of Virginia are being updated in 2022 for social studies, and the Governor's Commission of 2021 for the teaching of African American history finds us in a good position to build on the programs that we've done. You can see here a group of fourth graders on a tour of Diamond Hill histories with Allison Bell, a professor at Washington Lee of anthropology, talking about how different businesses and cultural and educational experiences have grown over time. Here we have students in middle schools advancing that with the histories of the school they study. And in the coming years, and indeed over the course of this summer, we look forward to developing the materials you're seeing here and finding ways to provide authentic learning experiences for students to encounter both the patterns of broad history that have been outlined here, but also some of the profiles that this particular model of research enables. And I'm particularly impressed, continually impressed at not just what Larry and Cinder continue to find or the kinds of things that Bill is able to add into those records, but the sensitivity and the purpose and the humanity that comes out with these stories. And we know from student experience, adult experience, those kinds of things are going to continue to spur passions for local history with this topic and others beyond. So we hope that you'll continue to look around our website. We hope you'll contact us, and we'll be glad to put you in touch with our researchers and other things as they evolve. If you have questions, email us. You can find us on Facebook. We look forward to engaging with you. We look forward to your joining us, and we look forward to having programs ahead where we can all meet in future once again. Thanks very much.